My name is Raphael, and I'm very happy to be here. First of all, I want to thank all the organizers and the amazing volunteers for this great conference. I think it's worth an applause. So who am I? Just a few kind of notes about myself. That's me. I like to go to conferences. That was EuroPython in Spain. And I like write the docs t-shirts, apparently. I'm a maintainer and core developer of the Cookie Cutter project and also PyTest. Both are Python projects, fairly popular, I would say. I also write, speak, and tweet about these projects and others. And I try to blog on my personal blog at raphael.codes. Just a few notes on what a maintainer is, because I feel like maybe that's not well known, and I think it's also really hard to explain because a maintainer wears very, very different hats, based on the situation. So it could be someone who's writing code, who's kind of active communicating with contributors, who writes documentation, who goes to conferences promoting the project, or gets emails. Like I get 30 emails a day from random people who think that my software is maybe not good, and maybe also 20 emails from people who think the software is actually good, so that's also nice. So it's like a whole lot of things, and it usually involves staying up late at night. But I'm also a documentarian. So 2 years ago at EuroPython, Mikey gave an amazing talk at EuroPython, and I decided that I just want to go to this awesome conference called Write the Docs 2 months later. So that was done. I'm Hackebrot on Twitter and on GitHub. Please don't ask me where this name comes from. Stupid thing, I'm German and I like hacking on things, so there is something going on now. So as an introduction to my talk, I want to talk a bit about the open source survey, which is something that the GitHub company did and published in June this year, and it's very interesting because I was thinking about giving this talk for quite some time, and this kind of gave me all the kind of scientific and research work which kind of underlines what I'm trying to say and which also relates to my work as a maintainer. And we heard also something about this earlier today in Laurie's talk already. So there were 5,500 randomly sampled respondents, like people from the community, in over 3,800 open source repositories and also 500 from other platforms. So one of the big outcomes, which was kind of viral then on like Hacker News, Reddit, everywhere, all the websites that you probably don't need, but also on Twitter and other places, yeah. And one of the outcomes was that documentation is highly valued, but often overlooked. And then what we also heard today, that it's oftentimes incomplete, outdated, and that's a real problem to essentially everyone. But only 60% would say that they rarely or never contribute to documentation. And I think that's really alarming. Then one of the other things was that they mentioned was that licenses are super important, but they are not taken really seriously. And that's one of the core elements of free, libre, and open source software. And this is like a serious problem if people don't really care about the licenses. And documentation helps create inclusive communities, which I think is one of the most important things actually in open source. And that's also, I'm German, I'm not English is not my primary language. Or maybe it's not my primary language, but it's not my mother language. So I kind of emphasize with a lot of people who struggle to write good documentation in English maybe. So the agenda for my talk today is what is exactly a Readme file, why it's so important for open source projects, what makes a good Readme, things you don't want to mention in your Readme, and then how you can kind of use this information from this talk for your own projects. So let's start with what is a Readme file? Sounds very simple, but it's not always the case. So first of all, it's a text file, and it lives inside of your code repository. It has like this name, and then it has a file extension, which is usually something MD for Markdown or RST for restructured text or something else. And on platforms like GitHub and GitLab or Bitbucket or somewhere else, they usually have a feature that will automatically render this file into an HTML. So that it looks nice and you can read it perfectly fine on screen. That's an example from some Python project. So the blue Readme RST thing, you can see it lives in the directory structure with the source code and other files. But it's also so much more. It's also the first impression that you get. Since those platforms that everyone uses, GitHub, GitLab, whatever, if you go to a project, the first thing that you see is always the rendered Readme file, and that's by convention. So it's the file that makes the first impression for your project. And it's also the file that people usually see first when they're upset, because they're running the software, they haven't read the documentation, they run into some feature maybe, or it's some bug maybe, and the first thing that they do is they go to the repository and they will look at the README. So you kind of have to think about it, that people might not be in like their happiest mood when they look at the README file. So there's the catch here, and the README files can look very, very different based on the project. Communities use READMEs for very different purposes. So there's always some common thing, but they also have like different kind of emphasis on different aspects. And ultimately, it's what helps you increase the adoption of your open source project and makes it popular or also successful. So just some examples to showcase kind of how they can differ. So that's from the cookie cutter project that I maintain, that's kind of the header. Then you see there's a features section, and then there's so much stuff. And then since it's using templates, we have different categories for different languages. And then beyond, like below that, there's a list of 100 different links. I'm not saying that this is good. I'm not really happy with the state of what it is, but it's currently what it looks like. Then there's the Flask micro framework for Python. And you can see it's not even RST, it's not Markdown, it's not rendered as HTML, because it's just text. But it looks good, and it has all the information that it needs. And it's like completely different than the first example. Next one, Django, the super popular web framework for Python. You can see they don't even bother like looking into features or whatever. They just directly point you to the documentation. And I think that's also a super valid approach. So why is it so important? As I said, it's the only thing, or like you have one chance to make the first impression. And I think that's why the README is so important. It decides over whether your project is successful or if it's a failure. But what does it mean? In my opinion, if you fail to appeal to users, the people won't use your project. If no one uses your project, you don't get feedback. If you don't get feedback, your project doesn't evolve much over time. So it will be in the same that you kind of came up with. And also, no one really wants to contribute, because if there are no users, that's usually some kind of metric that you use for deciding whether you want to contribute to a project. But there's also so much more. A README is documentation, and I think that's why this talk is also good for this conference, because it needs to be taken seriously and as a first-class citizen in software development, just as all the other aspects of documentation. And it can be consumed in very different ways. So as I mentioned, there are platforms, GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, wherever, and you see the HTML files. But there are also weird people like myself who just clone the repository and just read the text in their favorite editor of choice. So there's also, even if the HTML looks good, if you don't take care about the structure of the file itself, it will be super hard to just read as text. So I think if you are careful, you can be kind of nice to both worlds. And then there's also something else. So if you use command line tools, there's also something called --help, like a command line flag that you usually use. And there's also the thing on POSIX systems, on Linux or Mac OS, that you run this weird command called man, and then some other command. And I'm bringing up those examples because it's by convention and by like learning and experience that people know that there is this thing called --help, and even if you don't know it, you will probably try it and see if it shows you the help message. And the same goes for the man pages. You kind of expect that it shows you help. And I think a README file is exactly the same. So even if you don't know if a project has a README, you will probably try to find it somewhere in the code. And then there's this thing, docs or it didn't happen. And I'm not sure if Mikey's somewhere in the room, but this was kind of what sparked my passion for documentation in general, her amazing blog post from 2 years ago. And some of the major points in her blog post were that documentation is something that you do with other people. It's a collaborative effort, you're not alone, and words are work. So it's important. And it takes time and effort. And it's sometimes really hard for developers to do it because there is no like compiler who just yells at you for telling you, yeah, you're doing it wrong. You need to do this in order to make it work. So it can be way harder than writing code. But it's not as hard as you might think. And you probably all know that and would probably support this claim, kind of. But it's very different in the developer world, based on my experience at least. So the main thing to remember is kind of that it's something that you do with other people. So the feedback cycle is very important. You work on it over time. It's an iterative process. And I think that's important to remember. So what makes a good README file? So for me, it's this thing called empathy, a skill. And I think that's also what ultimately makes a good software engineer. Some people might question this, but let's look at what the formal definition of empathy is. So it's an ability to understand and share the feelings of another. So why do I bring this up for a README talk? I think it's important because you need to have empathy for newcomers to your project to understand, like, what do people who don't know anything about the project, what kind of expectations do they have? For more experienced users, they don't want to read like 200 pages of newcomer stuff just to kind of get to the essential answer to a question that they might have. It's also important for contributors. Does your project have a code of conduct? Do you have like a CLA that someone needs to sign before they can actually submit patches? And also for fellow maintainers. From my experience, it's like a lot of people volunteer their own spare time for working on open source projects, so it's kind of important that you understand that your fellow maintainers might have different priorities in their life right now. So I think that's a general skill that is required for being a good software engineer and also an open source maintainer to have this this feeling, or not feeling, but this ability of empathy. And now I want to touch a bit on a blog post that I read from Laurie, who gave an amazing talk this morning, and it's kind of suggesting that you should tell a story with your README file. So first you want to explain, where does your project come from? What problem does it solve? And also, why did you start it? And I'll have some examples on the next slides. You want to say, hey, this is how you install the project, and this is how you can get started. Also important is that you give an outlook on what is the kind of the direction that your project is kind of heading to, because it sets an expectation. Yeah, and that's kind of the next thing, is really that it's important also to stress what problems your project doesn't solve. And I learned this the hard way because I get angry emails from angry people, right? Because they say, hey, I've installed your tool and it doesn't do this magic thing that I wanted to do. And so, like the moment that I put a note on the README file saying, this is just like a weekend hack, please don't use it for production, then kind of the emails went away over time. So that's also some kind of like self-care for maintainers, to be explicit about these things and setting expectations. It's also good if you want to point users to different projects, which might be in a different programming language, but maybe solve exactly the problem that they try to solve. So this is an example from, this is really just a weekend hack. There are YAML parsers for the Python programming language, and they both didn't work on some weird combinations of operating systems and architectures. And then I was so fed up because people couldn't install a cookie cutter anymore, and the maintainers wouldn't respond to my issues. So I'm an engineer, so what do? I just write a third version, which, well, yeah, obviously. And as I mentioned, it was only meant to be used for the cookie cutter project. It was not a general purpose YAML browser thing. And I had to put those two notes in the top that please note that Polio supports only a chosen subset of the YAML formats. It can only read but not write and is not compatible with JSON. Because in the beginning, when people kind of wanted to use it, they were upset and frustrated and they sent angry emails, and I don't like that. Also, it's important to talk about prerequisites. What are the operating systems that you support? Do you use some kind of like Linux-specific features in your software? So you want to point out those things like right from the start. What are the programming language that are required on your operating system? And the dependencies, if they're important. Something that you usually see in Python project is in the script which runs the installation of the project. you will see those kind of checks, and if for instance, if it's running on a platform that is not supported, it will throw those errors. And that's good. I think that's required, but it's already a step too late. Like if you already run the command to install the project and then it explodes, I think it causes a whole lot of confusion and also frustration for the user. So you want to have installation instructions. You want to say, this is how you install the software. And I think it's important to only mention the preferred method. So we have so many different operating systems and people have the different kind of preferences. I think it's important to use, for instance, the programming language's packaging manager, and like leave all of the other alternative installation instructions to the documentation. So usually for my project, this is just a single line. Ginger Time is available for download from this and this. And then you say package manager install something. Another example for a Go project, you say go get and then the URL to the project. And that's it. I think that's, but most projects don't have that, and yet you try to find the same project on the packaging index, and this is just like too much effort, I think, and it's not very friendly to newcomers. Features, you also want to kind of promote your project. Why would anyone use your project? So list cool features, but make sure that you don't list all of them, because you don't want to go through like the super kind of crazy list of all of the features. Just pick a few. I think like 7 is okay, I guess, maybe a bit less, and only mention the important ones. Then I kind of expect a getting started section in your Readme file. So give a brief example. How do you actually use your code? And please make sure that the code actually works. Because that's like oftentimes the most frustrating thing ever. If you just copy paste some code snippet and it just explodes into your face. And then like I would usually just use something else instead, just because I know that the maintainer doesn't kind of care about me as a user. And even if I kind of somewhat get the software to work, I'm kind of already losing trust in the, in the empathy ability of the maintainers maybe. And link to the tutorial section. So Daniela talked about that you have those 4 quadrants, and I think it's important that from the getting started section you maybe want to link to your tutorials. So this is how a usage section can look like. It's just the main API kind of endpoint that you maybe want people to use first. License. So what license does your project use? This sounds like maybe like a very obvious thing, but if you don't kind of point to your license file, people effectively can't use your code. Because if you don't have a license, you also don't grant the rights to the users to actually use your code, modify it, and redistribute it. And that's also something that in the GitHub survey was kind of one of the outcomes, is that it's a very important piece of documentation for a lot of developers, that there is an open source license somewhere in the project, and it's kind of, that is obvious where to find it. So I would link to it from the README as well. Then maybe you want to have a troubleshooting section. So maybe some frequently asked questions. I don't know, why doesn't this write JSON files? And then maybe you as a maintainer get fed up over time, and as a matter of self-care, you kind of want to answer those questions, maybe somewhere in a dedicated section. You also want to link to the issue tracker and pull requests, because if someone is reading the file on their file system and their editor and they encounter a problem, you want to link them to where do you actually report an issue. And don't assume that everyone is reading the README file just on GitHub, for instance. And you also want to tell people how to get in touch, actually. So linked, like specify the channel and the server of IRC or Gitter or Slack or whatever service you want to use in your project. And also something which is, again, like I think one of the most important things about open source software is that you actually also specify some things about the community. So who are the people behind the project? For instance, for me it makes a big difference if there is like some multi-billion-dollar corporation behind a project and it's not really open source but more public source. So that, as we heard from Laurie, they just had this like project lying around and they just decided to dump it to their graveyard. If it's like that, I'm probably not going to use the project. If I know there is a team of, I don't know, 2 to 5 people who solved a very important problem for themselves, and that's also why they care for the project, I'm way more likely to actually use the project myself. How do you contribute to your project? So give instructions how to do it, how to set up the environment for testing, for writing documentation, all of that stuff, and take them like through the workflow of doing that. And also how to become a core team member, because that's oftentimes in open source projects really hard to figure out as a newcomer. So you submit patches, but then at some point you might get frustrated because you feel like you don't get the acknowledgement from the core team. So I think it's nice to point out how you actually become part of the core team. And also have a contributor code of conduct, but only if you really care about it and also want to also act on reports. So like, don't just copy a template if you don't really care. I think that's causing more problems than otherwise. That's an example from the pip project. And then just a couple of things that you really don't want to have in your README. And I think you folks, you all probably know that, but it's really not that clear for most developers. And please don't say just read the code. This is something you find quite often, and they have like this self-inflated ego of, yeah, I'm like this master of things and all of my code works without flaws and there are no bugs. That's not possible, and the API is so nice that you don't need documentation for it. But that's just not true. That's just not how it works. So I'm, as a software engineer, I think I can say that a lot of the code that we write is not very good, and it definitely requires documentation to be well consumed and used. And you also want to avoid those words. Easily, obviously, just. And I went through my very old blog posts, and they are all over the place. Just because, yeah, I wrote this awesome tool on my weekend, and yeah, it solves it. Like, my problem is solved, and it's so easy, and I'm the creator, and I'm so awesome, and that's why I need to tell everyone all the time. But you don't need that, so just omit those words. And the list goes on and on and on, kind of. So how do you improve your own project's README? I think a good README is a key component for successful, and if you care about that, popular open source project, so you definitely want to kind of care about this part of the project. Do peer reviews. Why don't you use the same kind of techniques that have proven to be very important for writing software? Why don't you do that for your documentation as well? Let someone else read it, maybe someone who does speak a different language. Make sure that they understand the same language that you use. Don't use idioms or jokes or anything that can be misunderstood in a different context. So kind of get feedback from people. And also, we do that at developer conferences, and we have the writing day here. I think that's great for working on documentation. So you can kind of pick a section of your docs and work on that in a dedicated time slot. And that's also really important, I think. Encourage people to submit patches for your documentation. So some maintainers usually get really frustrated and angry when they get like this patch and it just fixes a typo of a single character. But I don't really understand why this is actually a problem. Like, you should be really grateful and happy that people care about the project so much to set up your project, go through all of this hassle of using Git, maybe if they're not used to it, and then like submitting this patch. And I think it's really important because over time you will have a better documentation and by that also a better project. So if you want to find out more, there's like this awesome guide on our community site. Then there's also this great blog post that I mentioned from Mikey and the blog post from Laurie. And then something entirely different, I would be super interested in working as a developer advocate going forward. So if your company sees developer advocacy under engineering rather than pre-sales, if you care about or if you recognize the importance of diversity and inclusion, and also if you create open source software and also allow your engineers to contribute upstream, I would be interested in talking to you. That's my email. If you want to get in touch, I'd be happy to talk to you. And because from my experience, again, like people, when engineers in my teams, they were always like super bored and frustrated when we had to work on documentation. So kind of to what I learned throughout the years is that documentation can be super fun and you can have a lot of passion for it. And that's something that I tweeted some time ago, and the reason was because Sam, one of the co-organizers of this conference, made those awesome t-shirts. So I decided to tweet that and post this picture along with it. So I think documentation isn't boring. I think it's fun, and you should be proud of your work. And that's me.